Excellent. Many thanks, Paul, and thank you to all the people who are attending today. It's great to be here. I'm really honoured to have the chance to say a few words. I will be relatively brief, but hopefully provide an overview of some of the work that we've done with local trusts. And I please do refer you to the publication of this little pamphlet, which Matt and Margaret and the guys at Local Trust encouraged me to publish a few years back, called Skittled Out. That will say far more eloquently than I will today a range of things about social infrastructure. I'll do my best, but please do refer to that, because a lot of thought and research went into that, and that will sum things up probably far better than I can in a few minutes. Just to introduce myself, so my name's Dan. I work on a range of different things all around civil society, social enterprise, funding, finance of charities and cooperatives, voluntary organisations. I spent some of my time at Social Enterprise UK, but also do a range of other pieces of research and policy work. And I was delighted 2 or 3 years ago to work with Local Trust to sort of do an investigation, theoretically and practically, into the idea of social infrastructure. So I will try my best to try and sum up a little bit of what that might mean, how people might understand it, maybe even try and define it a little bit. In my social enterprise work, we spend a lot of time, and probably too much time, debating definitions, but I'm delighted today to be able to kind of start to try and talk a little bit about definitions of social infrastructure, which is something that people increasingly seem to be talking about, but actually there's a range of views on what is actually meant by that. The place I will start, if it's okay with you, is the slides. And Rob, I don't know if people can see them on the screen now. Can you see the slides? Great. Thank you, Rob. So I think the first place to start, this is a sort of thematic which has been developed by NCVO, the National Council for Voluntary Organisations, in their wonderful almanac, which they publish every year or two. Again, please look at that brilliant research resource. Don't worry about being able to see everything in the little bubbles. The main point of this, of grounding, of thinking about social infrastructure, is these kind of 3 dimensions of our lives in the economy and society. And I think what frustrates me as someone who works in the world of charities and voluntary organisations and social enterprises, too often you find that the public, the media, politicians to a degree, often seem to emphasise the sort of dichotomy of the state and the market, the private sector and the public sector. And it might be a political thing, it might be thinking about perhaps sort of history of left and right. If you're talking about the railways, the arguments tend to be nationalise, privatise, use business, use the states, and that's the kind of dichotomy. And just from my perspective, on the corner I sit in, it always feels like, what about this other dimension of society, communities, which does rear its head, but maybe not as much as I would like to see, and some of us would like to see in kind of public debate. So you can see this triangle. At the top, you've got the public sector, bottom right, the market, businesses, private enterprise, and bottom left, communities. And you can see that actually it's not sort of cut and dried. There's grey areas, things like universities, housing associations, are they technically public sector? Maybe not. Charities, sometimes they're trading in markets, sometimes they're reliant on voluntary income. So there's shades here, and it's quite sort of complex picture. But the main point here is really to emphasise that the way that it structures organisations' activity is organised around us in this country is not just about public and private, state and market. There's this other kind of coming together of social, community, voluntary, mutual activity, which doesn't fall under either necessarily profit-motivated private enterprise or publicly command and control of the state. And this is, I think, important to ground social infrastructure. Right, the second slide, please, Rob, if that's okay. Before I kind of try and define social infrastructure, just introducing the second word there, infrastructure, is in all honesty, clearly an incredibly boring word. You know, it's not a word which we like to talk about. It's not a word which excites people. It's a word that maybe took a while to sort of enter, I guess, sort of public debate. Politicians talk about it a bit more now maybe with their hard hats and their yellow jackets on, with a photo shot in front of some new high-speed rail network. Infrastructure starts to become more of our sort of the public sphere in the way that we talk about it. But it's taken a while. And this, I think, is interesting, which is about infrastructure estimates over the period of 2006 to 2016, which is to show that how this has increased over that time. So this is in a period where actually, the government, the belt was quite tight. There's huge sort of debates around social care investment, NHS, a period of austerity this is perceived to be or is. But actually, even this time, infrastructure investment is increasing. So this really boring, sort of little known area of the economy, even in tough times, even in constrained fiscal climate, you see an increase in infrastructure investment. And what this says to me is that even if it's boring, even if it's not sort of people aren't on the streets chanting for more infrastructure, the case, if you like, for infrastructure, for economic infrastructure, has kind of been won in the Treasury and in the important parts of government. That effectively it's been acknowledged that private enterprise, public sector, public services cannot just be run with more day-to-day investment of increasing enlisted salaries, recruiting more teachers, paying for more trains. You have to have that investment in the underlying structures, whether that's the national grid, whether it's the rail network, whether it's new hospitals. The underlying structures on which those activities run are essential to efficiency, to increases in productivity and activity. You cannot just pay for the day-to-day spending, you have to have that investment in the underlying structures. And I think really that's what I think is quite a banal insight at the heart of the booklet that I did, is if you put those two graphs together, if you like, the case for infrastructure and the triangle about the three parts of our economy, I arrive at a question of what about social infrastructure? If various governments have been interested in things like volunteering, social enterprise, community sort of cohesion, people helping each other out over the garden fence in communities, whatever it is. Why aren't we thinking about the idea of social infrastructure and that the social activity will not run by itself with a bit more, maybe some spending, but maybe some urging and nudging and encouragement and campaigns, but actually it relies on the existence of underlying social infrastructure. And this was the work that I guess I embarked on, was to kind of look and try and understand what is this social infrastructure? What are the underlying structures and sort of platforms that allow that activity to happen? So let me just give you, I guess, two definitions of this stuff. So maybe you agree, maybe you might not agree, but just so you have a sense of what I think I'm talking about. One definition says that social infrastructure refers to the range of activities, organisations and facilities supporting the formation, development and maintenance of social relationships in a community. So it's not the relationships themselves, it's not the development of those, it's the stuff that underpins that supports those social relationships. Another one, these are the places and structures and buildings or clubs that enable people to get together, meet, socialise, volunteer, cooperate. Again, it's not the socialising, the volunteering, meeting, it's the places, structures and buildings, clubs, organisations, whatever, that enable that to happen. So other people use social infrastructure in a much wider sense. They say education at the NHS is part of our social infrastructure. I don't really like that definition. I'm not for a minute saying that those things aren't important, but to me they're not infrastructure, they are services. The National Health Service delivers services, our schools and hospitals are part of the welfare state where the services have been provided. It's about the structures that allow that to happen, that underpin that. And I think that's what I think has been missing, is this interest in our social infrastructure. So what are these places? What are they? Who owns them? Who runs them? Who controls them? Are we investing in them? And that's what I set out to explore a little bit. So if we could keep going, Rob. I mean, largely these places are physical structures. They're buildings that you will know in your communities. So they might be civic, they might be village halls, music venues, libraries, art galleries. They might be religious institutions. They could be quite traditional institutions of working men's clubs, WI, sports clubs and so on, but they may equally in sort of 21st century become more digital places, digital hangouts. It might be things like Mumsnet or even Facebook or Google Groups or whatever people use. And I guess if we're asking about what are the places that support that social interaction, these places themselves may be public or privately owned and controlled, even if they're facilitating activity, which that activity is not publicly controlled or privately determined. So it could be cafes, bingo halls, skittle alleys that are owned by private individuals, but they allow people to come together. They could be public, they could be in education establishments and schools and colleges after hours. They could be indoors and outdoors. It could be allotments and parks and gardens. It could be, at the side of a cycle path. They could be infrastructure in the voluntary sector, like community councils of voluntary action, sort of structures within civic society. So that's a kind of trying to map it, and then I think the next question is where's it going? Is it thriving? Is it dying? How is it evolving in the UK? This slide here, I think, is a good example of, I think, this was in Southampton. This is a previously controlled by the council, so it was a public asset. And then they looked at handing it over to a local community group. As you can see, it's not in the best state. And I think this is kind of one example of what we see in some communities where there was big investment post-war in sort of village halls, community centres and so on. And there's been many more built more recently as well, but there's some which are kind of left as they're neither this nor that. They haven't been renewed and updated. They sort of survive. And this is probably in the POS of sort of public or community or publicly owned social infrastructure. If we keep going, Rob, as well, so the next one. This, on the other hand, just around the corner was a pub. So actually, in a way, a lot of this is not about public sector budgets, local authority, being under pressure to support social care and advent of austerity and so on. Many of these places and structures that enable that social interaction are indeed privately owned. So if you look at pubs, if you look at bingo halls, if you look at skittle alleys, these are things which no one expects them necessarily to be owned by the public sector or by the community, although of course we see some wonderful examples of community ownership in pub world where communities have come together to save their pubs, but actually these are privately owned structures. And this is a really good example of a pub that was really important to the community. And it was kind of pulled overnight. The brewery or the chain that own it closed it down with about a sort of week or 2 weeks notice. And the community had sort of no knowledge of it, no influence over that. And whether these structures are publicly owned or privately owned, it seemed to me that a lot of the ones that had been important in many of these communities were controlled remotely, whether that was by the headquarters of a brewery in London or elsewhere, or by the council or the NHS headquarters, Property Co in Leeds or something that was making a decision about an asset that was perhaps important to a local community. And it didn't feel like this infrastructure was in any way under the control or influence of the local community. If you look at some of the figures around these kind of buildings and structures and places, there's many reports where you see kind of how many post offices might have closed or how many pubs might have closed. In the booklet you can see I've tried to bring some of these together, and I think it's quite terrifying really when you look at the numbers of pubs that have closed and libraries and youth centres and so on, post offices. But this isn't just about public or private. This is all of these places. That it's not about one government or all governments. It's a long trend over the last 10, 20 years where we're seeing the patterns within society change. The way that our sort of the way that we meet in communities are changing, and the way that these assets are controlled is evolving. I think probably the final one, Rob, is the kind of question of, so what do we do about this? And if you, I guess, in any way, my argument that there are some places which people don't really think about too much, don't think about collectively, they're really important to the way that people get together and form that sense of community cohesion, of understanding each other, of socialising with each other, of realizing that we're all kind of part of the same community in a wider sense. What do we do about this? And I think there's two things that I'd like to highlight. The first one is, again, from the lesson of economic infrastructure. So this is from the report of the Infrastructure and Projects Authority. I think it used to be called UK Infrastructure. It sort of sits in the Treasury and maybe Cabinet Office, I think. And this was created in the last few years, or its former versions of it, because of the realization that we need to take stock of our infrastructure in this country. Do we have an economic infrastructure deficit? And I think it was the OECD that said the UK had an economic infrastructure deficit, and the Treasury sat up and thought about this. And under George Osborne, I guess even in those tough times, there was this acknowledgement that we still had to invest in infrastructure. and therefore part of government is responsible for mapping, counting, tracking, making the case for how much of this stuff we have, what state it's in, are we maintaining it, are we refreshing it, are we building suitable infrastructure for the 21st century. There is a bit of government that has formal responsibility for this, but it's entirely, I guess, what you could call economic infrastructure. There is no part of government, or indeed as it seems anywhere, that is mapping what's the state of our social infrastructure. And yes, people use other words, you can argue about the term, but when I sort of listed out in the booklet the pubs that have closed and the post offices that have closed, I couldn't find anyone else that had done that. There was no other place where that was all brought together. There's one or two journalists have done one or two articles subsequently, but the fact that no one is really taking stock of that and worrying about this and counting it, I think that in itself is something that the government or indeed others should look at. And the final point is, I was encouraged by Matt and co to try and be practical in making recommendations as well, is to think about future pots of money. Now, whether that's the future of EU structural funds, their replacement, whether it's pots of unclaimed assets and dormant accounts, which might be coming online in the next few years, whether it's central government money, that look like there could be some interesting models which we could advocate for, what you might call a community wealth fund, which are pots of money that take maybe lessons from local trusts, lessons from some work the lottery's done, lessons from community pub ownership, lessons from cooperative movement across the country, lessons from some of the great practice of grant makers and philanthropists, and start to think about how we could create pots of money to invest in the long-term sustainable wealth of our communities and the social infrastructure which helps bind them together. So please look at the booklet. I've tried to summarise it as best I can and try to define it as best I can, and hopefully that's a good place to leave it to kick off a wider discussion. So thank you, Paul, and thank you all.